very favorites in financial management. And here it says, in making financial decisions, a financial manager must have a good understanding of the relationship of risk and return, right? Whenever a decision or choice is made, it involves the evaluation and consideration of the balance of the good and the bad outcomes, okay? And here, when we're talking about a decision, we're talking about a decision pertaining to an investment, a decision pertaining to investment returns, and such nature. All right. Now, the potential for bad outcomes are called risk. All right. And that is the possibility that a chosen action or inaction will result in undesirable outcomes. Some decisions, actions, inactions are riskier than others. All right. And it is our job as financial managers to identify which decisions, financial decisions, of course, are risky, all right, or riskier than others, okay? Risk and return may be viewed from the perspective of a single asset or an entire portfolio of assets, all right? I like the saying, without risk, there is no reward. Okay, in finance, we just use the term return. But the principle and logic is pretty much the exact same. Okay, and finally, on this slide, they say the evaluation and measurement of risk and return is essential for operation, for investment, and for financial decisions. But let's move on. So in this learning unit, the stuff that we will be looking at or covering is the fundamentals of risk and return, okay? The procedures for assessing and measuring risk for a single asset and a portfolio of assets, how to assess the risk and return characteristics of a portfolio through correlation and diversification. And then you've got a look, or we begin to delve into systematic and unsystematic risk, right? And then we go on to look at how an asset or portfolio's beta, we will look into what beta is, all right, may be used to assess risk and return behavior against the market. Oh my goodness, it gets even better. And then finally, the capital asset pricing model. What is this thing? As a method for calculating an asset's required rate of return. Ooh, what a learning unit. Okay, but before we go too far, okay, firstly, in finance, risk is defined as the probability that an investment may yield a return that is different from what is expected, from what it is that we actually desire or want, okay? But primarily what is expected, okay? Because the reality is we can anticipate that we are going to get 20% return, but the reality on the ground floor is we might end up getting 10% return, or we might end up getting even a negative 20% return, okay? So risk is the probability that we may yield that type of result, where we get a negative 20% or a 10% where we expected to get 20%. Although an investment manager is generally concerned with the loss-making risk of an investment, risk itself explains the volatility of an investment which suggests the probability of a deviation from the mean, okay, that could be either positive or negative. Remember, I used two examples. I said 10%, okay, and I said negative 20%. But you could also get a deviation, right, which is greater than the expected, all right, such as a positive 25%. We were only expecting 20%, okay? This implies that the riskier an investment is, the greater the potential yield, a higher than expected return with a simultaneously greater potential for lower return, all right? Risk is also closely associated with uncertainty. Uncertainty is the circumstance in which financial manager either cannot identify all the possible outcomes or has identified the possible outcomes but cannot assess or associate the probability to each. So risk and uncertainty are closely related. You can almost say they are cousins, but they're not exactly the same thing. When it comes to uncertainty, we're talking about the inability to identify the outcomes, okay, associated to a decision, or the inability to associate the probability of all the identified potential outcomes, okay? Though that we are talking about uncertainty. In risk, we can identify all the potential outcomes. However, we are not sure of which outcome may result, okay? But we are sure of all the outcomes. We can associate probabilities, in other words, likelihoods to those potential outcomes, okay? Whereas with uncertainty, there is uncertainty, there is a lack of surety in regard to certain aspects. But let's move on. We now look at the definition of return, okay? Here they are saying to be in a position to assess risk and the impact of variability, it is important to have an understanding of return and how to go about measuring it. Return is defined as the gain or loss of an investment over a known period of time. Very important. It's over a specified period of time. Okay? It can be a gain and it can be a loss. All right? Usually calculated as a percentage, return represents the sum of your capital gains and your income received in terms of cash flows over the specified investment period. Okay? And then there we have the formula for your, we have your formula for your return. All right, for calculating your return. So RT, okay, is basically the return at the end of the period, okay, which is made up of PT, okay, which is basically, you could call it your principal or your value of the investment at the end of the period. So, you know, by now you guys are now used to timelines, okay? So obviously P0 would be the price of the investment at time 0, okay, the beginning. And then obviously this is, we're now at time T, and we want to calculate the return of this investment, okay? And then CT is the cumulative cash flows. In other words, the payments, the money we would have received over the period of time relating to this investment. Okay, so I would even put brackets over here, to be honest with you, divided out by our initial price. That is going to give you a return in percentage terms. Yes. So pretty straightforward. Okay, oh, actually, you would then say times 100 here, because your chances are you would get a decimal. Ooh, let me erase and do things neatly. Times 100, okay, to get a percentage. Okay, right, but we get the point. Right, let's move on to the next slide. Number 5, risk preferences. Okay, now this is now speaking to each of us as individuals. We are not the same, and when looking at risk, we are also acknowledging that it says everybody has a different tolerance or appetite for and attitude towards risk. Risk tolerance refers to what an individual considers to be acceptable or unacceptable outcomes that deviate from the expected. Okay, some of us, we are not scared of taking a chance. Okay, some of us are not scared of bungee jumping. Okay, others, we play it safe. We'd rather be watching Netflix than do something adventurous. We are wired differently. And so here, likewise, with our risk, we're willing to take on certain investments that others would not be willing to take on. Why? Because of the risk associated with them, and in turn because of our risk appetite, our willingness to accept that we may lose everything that we've invested, while others are like, I'm willing to only lose half. Okay, so this speaks to our attitude and appetite for risk. So you have three types of risk attitudes. All right, you have your risk averse individual, you have your risk neutral, and you have your risk seeking. Now, when it comes to risk averse, you're basically saying this individual has a very low risk tolerance level. All right, extremely low risk appetite. If we can avoid risk altogether, that is this individual. Okay, now if they do take on risks, right, they will expect a higher level of return, all right, for an increased level of risk. Okay, so you must reward that individual for the additional risk that they're taking on. Okay, most financial managers will fall into this category. Okay, because obviously we want to justify the risk that we are taking on. So it's preferable that a manager obviously does not wish to put the funds of a company at risk. Okay, all right. If they do so, then the return must be worth it. Okay, all right. But let's move on to risk neutral. Risk neutral, they have an indifferent attitude towards risk. Okay, a risk neutral financial manager will not expect a higher level of return as the level of risk increases. Okay, they don't mind taking on more risk, they don't mind. Risk seeking individuals, now these are the extreme guys, they're the guys on the other end. They want to take on risk. All right, why? Because they want high exceptional returns. Okay, but now they are risk seeking to the point where they do not take the time to actually really acknowledge the levels of risks, the level of risk of certain projects. Okay, which means that they can put the business's funds at substantial levels of risk just with the desire of returning of experiencing, sorry, substantial returns, which can be problematic because, you know, for you to earn that 77 million in the lottery, okay, okay, you're putting down low amounts of money. But if you're, let's say, had to put a substantial amount of money and you're only thinking about the reward, but not acknowledging the risk of how much you may actually lose, that becomes problematic. Okay, we need to balance our risk versus reward. Okay, now here we now speak to procedures for assessing the risk of a single asset. You got two means that we primarily use, and you use both for whether it's a single asset or whether it's an actual portfolio. But here, you've got sensitivity analysis. This is basically what if analysis, okay? And so here we are basically using a variable, we're flexing it, all right? We're changing it, okay? To determine and quantify how the cash flows will be impacted, okay? Will there be a significant knock if we adjust this particular variable, okay? And a popular method of assessing sensitivity is to take a range of outcomes, okay, and categorize them as best case scenario, expected case, and then worst case scenario, okay? Now, important, how do we look at the risk? We look at the range in this particular case. The range is calculated by deducting the worst case from the best case. And the bigger your range, okay, so, okay, these are two ranges. This is range number one, okay? In between is your range, okay? All right. And then you've got number two, Okay, this is best. I'm just going to put B, and this is worst. This is best, and this is worst. Now you ask yourself, which one is the riskier? And it is obviously number 2, okay? Because basically we're saying we can get any number of outcomes between these 2. We can get the best, potentially, okay? Or we can get the worst. Or we can get anything between these 2, okay? Let me complete my X's over here. Let me do the right thing. And the same case for option 1. But can you see there's less variability or volatility with option 1. So can you see it is less riskier? So here they actually say the greater the risk associated with an asset, okay, or portfolio, the higher the range will be. Can you see here? We've got the higher range, which means more risky. Isn't it? Okay. All right. But enough said there. Let's move. Let's move. Slide number 7. This is now the other means of assessing risk, probability analysis. And you guys have gone through this in statistics. Ha! Believe it or not. Believe it or not. All right. You tried to run away from statistics. Statistics has come and found you in financial management. And even this sensitivity, you've done it in finance 2 with your cost volume profit analysis. That's what we were doing. We were doing sensitivity analysis, okay? When we were playing around with break even, all right? When we were playing around with demand, okay? We were doing sensitivity analysis. Yes, welcome to school. Probability analysis evaluates the separate probabilities associated with each different outcome of a project. This analysis allows for the quantitative assessment of a project through the calculation of an expected value, all right, provided that each project outcome and associated probability are known. Very important. We cannot actually conduct effective probability analysis without knowing, 1, the outcomes, the likely outcomes, and 2, the probabilities. I'm just going to write probabilities of those associated outcomes. Okay, they must be known. Okay, the expected value of an investment is calculated as the sum of each possible outcome multiplied by the probability or likelihood for each outcome that will occur. Okay, probabilities must add up to 1 or 100%. Okay. Procedures for measuring the risk of a single asset. Risk can also be measured using statistical techniques. Okay, we have defined risk as the range or the distance between the actual and the expected outcome or expected value. In statistics, the variables to quantify the risk are the standard deviation, all right, and the coefficient of variation. Concepts you have touched in statistics in your second year. All right, so this is more of a recap. All right, so risk is commonly expressed as the standard deviation volatility. You will see the higher you go up with your finance, the more they will just speak to volatility when talking about risk. Okay, all right, so the standard deviation is expressed as the standard deviation or the volatility, which is the square root of the variance. Okay, yes. So there you go. You've got 2 formulas that we utilize. The first one here is if we have different probabilities associated to our expected returns, okay? But the second one, if all your potential outcomes have the same probabilities, equal probabilities, should I say, equal probabilities, then you use the second one, isn't? All right. So there you can then also see what each variable stands for. And this is literally plug and play. Okay. Then we have the coefficient of variation. Measures the relative dispersion of each return measure against the measure of risk. Your CV is useful in assessing the relative risk of an asset, which have different expected returns. Okay, the relative risk of the asset. Okay, the lower the CV, the more favorable. We want a low coefficient of variance. Okay. Okay, so here, the lower the CV, the more favorable is the trade-off between the expected return and risk. Okay, so in other words, you're saying, it's less likely to vary. Okay, yeah, English is failing me, but I hope you get the point. Okay, I hope you get the point. Okay, so here again, I think the best thing is to take the relative dispersion of each return, okay, measure against the measure of risk. Okay, when explaining this, I think that would be the most efficient way to view it and to obviously share if ever asked to define. Conversely, the higher the CV, the more adverse the trade-off between expected return and risk. Therefore, the riskier, okay, the more averse, okay, the higher the CV, okay. Remember, we said we want a low CV. So if you've got a high CV, then obviously you are expecting a greater return. You desire greater, because obviously this asset is more risky. Here they've said the investment is riskier, okay. If something is riskier, we expect higher returns, okay. And there's your formula. It's the standard deviation divided by the expected return, okay, the expected return of the asset. Okay, procedures for measuring the risk and return of a portfolio. Okay, so here, if you look there, measuring the return of a portfolio, okay, you can see you're basically just getting the weighting of each of your potential returns from each of your assets. Okay, so let me say the expected return of each of your assets, or the return of each of your assets, times their weighting. Okay, you're going to add one after the other. Weighting times its expected return, or its return. If you have 5 assets, then you obviously have, this will be number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You add up all of those, and the weightings must obviously add up to 100%. Okay, right. So that is pretty much your calculation. But let's see what of some of the stuff they were saying here. Okay. A financial manager's objective is to create and effectively manage a diverse portfolio that offers the most efficient balance of risk and return to a business. Okay. To do this, a financial manager will need a way to calculate and measure return and risk for the portfolio of assets. Okay. And not just a single asset in isolation. Okay. 9 times out of 10, that is the case. You will be working with a portfolio and not just one asset. Okay. And not just one asset, particularly if you go into the space of investments. Okay. If you are a financial analyst, you'll be analyzing a portfolio or a number of different assets. Okay. Not just one. All right. No, that's fine. So let's move. Okay. Measuring the standard deviation of a portfolio. The standard deviation of a portfolio of returns can be calculated in the same way as a single asset. Okay. And there you can just refer to example 3.8 in your textbooks to have a look at how you would then apply the formula pertaining to that of a what you call this, portfolio. Right. So then we move on to correlation. Very important concept when looking at portfolios. Okay. Correlation describes how strong a relationship is between two variables. In this particular case, two assets. Okay. Okay. You can only be looking at two assets at a particular time. Numbers are positively correlated if they tend to move in a similar direction or directions. Okay. Negatively correlated assets are if they tend to move in opposite directions. Okay. Correlation is typically measured using the correlation coefficient denoted as R. Okay. A series of numbers is said to be perfectly correlated if your R, or your coefficient, correlation coefficient, is a +1. That means that they both move in exactly the same direction. Okay, right? So if one is increasing, the other is increasing. Okay. If one is decreasing, the other is also decreasing. Okay. If the R, or your correlation coefficient, is -1, all right, or if it is 0, then there is, okay. If it is -1, that means they move in the perfect opposite direction. Okay, so if one is increasing, that means the other is decreasing. Okay, all right. If it is 0, that means that there is no linear relationship between the two series, or the two assets in this particular case. Now, we move on to the next very important topic or subject matter in relation to creating a portfolio: diversification. And what is diversification? It refers to investing in more than one asset as a means of spreading and reducing risk. This is why we construct portfolios as financial professionals, to reduce the risk. Because if you only hold one asset and that asset tanks, okay, guess what happens? Your investment, everything that you've invested in that one asset, goes bust. Okay, right? So what do? Invest in different assets. You can have a little something in Bitcoin if you believe in it. Okay, a little something in Ethereum if you believe in that. Then have something in the Satrix. Have something in the Aussie. Okay, and then also have a little something where? In some stocks in Google. Okay, or in Apple, right? Such that if Google is doing badly, Apple is maintaining the return of your portfolio. Okay, the principle behind diversification is the value of the whole, okay, your whole portfolio is greater than the sum of its parts. Why? All right, why? Because it reduces the impact of your losses on any of your respective assets. Okay. In other words, assuming that there is little to no correlation between movements in asset values in the portfolio, the risk of the portfolio will be less, okay, which is what I've just been saying. The risk of the portfolio will be less than the aggregate weighted average risk of each individual asset in the portfolio, okay? Most financial managers, being risk averse, will want to diversify that should be diversified to some degree. Okay, it is for this reason that the use of correlation is an essential tool for efficient portfolio management. Why? Because we're saying if this asset decreases, that's fine, because we have another asset which is not correlated to it, which means it's not also going to decrease, or we have another asset or the other asset which is going to increase when the other is decreasing. So can you see that is steadying out your returns, even though you have some assets that are negatively performing. In building a portfolio, a financial manager will be looking for assets that tend to have a negative or zero correlation in order to reduce the variability of returns and the risk in the entire portfolio. So here in your lovely textbooks, your Edge textbooks, you have asset A, okay, which you can see the returns there. You can see the returns there, okay, for asset A, okay, right? And you can see they're not straight, which means they vary. They're up and down over time, okay? And you see B, which has higher returns, but also even more volatile, because you can see it's got higher highs and lower lows than that of asset A, okay? Right, so if we have a portfolio where we have both A and B in the portfolio, you'll see now you then average out your return on the diversified portfolio. Yes, it is less than the return of what you would get out of A and less than the return that you would get out of B, but guess what? At least it steadies your returns. It reduces your risk of experiencing significant losses. Okay, and this is what this slide is pretty much just explaining. So you can then obviously just read through that. But the last thing that I want to quickly touch on, which is over the next 2 slides, is the impact of international assets on a portfolio. Okay, now the reality is that you can only achieve only so much diversification by, let's say, only diversifying here in our lovely borders of South Africa. So we then say, let us also then, if possible, if you have the means, all right, and the opportunity, let's also invest or diversify our portfolio internationally, all right, so that if we have any particular economic events that happen within this particular country, then we at least have 20% or 30%, whatever portion is invested internationally, that is not affected by what would have happened to our investments in this local economy. Okay, so here it says, typically, the economies of countries behave in different ways, particularly between developed, emerging, and developing economies. Okay, holding an international diversified portfolio of investments may prove advantageous in the poor returns experienced by in that poor returns experienced by one country would be offset by the favorable returns of another. Generally, in the long term, internationally diversified portfolios yield a comparatively similar return to a reduced level of risk. For a reduced level of risk. And alternatively, a higher level of return for the same level of risk. Despite its benefits, there are several drawbacks. Okay, so it's not all rosy when we go in diversify internationally. Okay, drawbacks to international diversification. There are some disadvantages. Let's see. You have exposure to currency fluctuations. Okay, right? Especially us being in an emerging economy. And let's say we wanted to invest in a developed economy, okay, or developing economy. Obviously, those exchange rates can fluctuate, okay. Then there's political risk, okay. Then there's obviously different fiscal policies can leave one adversely exposed. Okay. Not all international markets will perform as well as the domestic market. Okay. And we must accept this when we go and diversify internationally. And international market restrictions also exist. Okay. Such as exchange controls that limit an investor's ability to repatriate foreign profits may serve as a strong deterrent to foreign investment. So sometimes there's caps on how much capital you can take out of a country. Okay, so you've invested your money, you've gotten a return. You now want to sell all your what do they call this? SMP shares, and guess what? America may have capped you at a certain amount. And so you can't actually bring that money or get that money into South Africa, okay, because of such caps. Additionally, increased political uncertainty and turmoil in some markets may make returns extremely volatile. Okay, all right. But let's park the bus there. And when we get back, we will finish off the remaining slides.